Straight talk about the issues you care about the most. It's LaVeist and ClaVille, empowerment for the culture. Now, your hosts, Dr. Will LaVeist and Dr. Eric ClaVille.
Hey, I'm Will LaVeist. He's Eric ClaVille. You tune into LaVeist and ClaVille, where we give it to you straight the way it is from a black male's perspective, because it's like that, and that's the way it is. So let's get right to this show, which is a sad topic and a very crucial and concerning topic, the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. The not guilty on all charges verdict in the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse for fatally shooting two men and injuring a third during civil unrest in Kenosha, Wisconsin, was in 2020, back when he was 17 years old then. And that trial that just concluded has generated a lot of anger, some glee, and also a lot of fear. You know, people are wondering if the trial gives a green light to vigilantism. There's also a lot of misinformation and manipulation that's going on around the political sphere, depending on which side of this issue that you're on. So just to give a little background on what the charges were, Rittenhouse is now 18. Like I said, back then he was 17. He was not charged with murder. He faced charges of first-degree reckless homicide, first-degree intentional homicide, and attempted first-degree intentional homicide during a protest following the police shooting of Jacob Blake. And Rittenhouse was also charged with reckless endangerment of two additional men. So, Eric, you being the attorney, I mean, there's a lot of misunderstanding in terms of the law. There's a lot of misinformation. Let's try to help to clear it up by, establishing some things and what's going on here to help people understand what this case, what it all means.
Yeah. So, Will, I mean, to your point, this is one of those jury verdicts that is reminiscent, I believe, of what we saw pre-civil rights era legislation, where we had nearly all white juries basically let white men off the hook for these types of actions. Now, of course, we do have the justice system, and we have to trust our system that it works because it's a process. Of course, we have the appellate process, we can appeal, and so forth, but the judicial process actually works when you are well prepared for it. I will say, just from observing in the trial itself, I thought that the prosecution was not as best prepared compared to the Minnesota prosecution. I thought that this case was one where it would set a precedent for or against these types of actions. Where we look at individuals taking the law in their own hands. It's basically vigilantism versus protectionism. We see that through history. We've seen white males throughout our history take it upon themselves to be protectors of their country, protectors of their border, protectors of their communities and things of that nature.
Yeah, that's a justification for the lynch mobs and the like. Yeah.
Absolutely, where they were both accusers, judge, jury, and executors, all in one action. So, again, I kind of want us to take a look at this particular verdict and the situation, the time, place, and circumstance in its totality, right? So, as you mentioned, historically, that was a justification for lynch mobs. That was a justification for the Klan. That was justification for individuals that are going to the border. And just as a side note, I don't know where people get time in their day to actually go, at the border to assist federal officers in doing their job. But again, I digress. But with that, this case, I believe, has set a precedent that it is okay to take the law in your own hands and become a protector of your community. Now,
let's parse that out a little bit though, because in Rittenhouse, what he said was first of all, he was asked to go there by his employer. He did work in the city. He lived in nearby Illinois. He worked there. He was asked by his employer because of the unrest that happened to help protect the property. So he went there. That was his defense, that he said he was going there to protect property. It's also was identified that he did, in fact, technically, legally, had the weapon. And these gentlemen that he encountered, my condolences go out to the family anytime lives are lost.
Absolutely.
And I think that we need to remember that lives were lost in this. But he said that, again, he had a right to be there, was a defense. He had a right to have the firearm. He was protecting property. How is that the same as you going to a protest and to encounter protesters and taking on protesters? How can you clear that up for people? Because that's a lot of what's being said, but that's not how it played out in the courtroom.
Right. So, it's one thing to stand in front of your property and protect it, and another thing to run through the streets with the AR-15 waving at officers and things of that nature. Which, you think about it, you have a kid with an AR-15 rifle, automatic rifle. He's walking the streets and he's waving at officers, and they're waving back at him. All right, so think about that.
Oh yeah, I think about that, right?
So now, keep in mind, this is a white young man. Could a black young man walk down the street with an AR-15 rifle and wave at the officers and get a wave back? Or will he get a wave of bullets back? Right?
Well, we know the answer to that, absolutely.
Well, do we? Do we know the answer to it? We think we know the answer to it. We're pretty sure we know the answer to it, but I think it has to be articulated. And I think most people will say no. They will not get a wave back. They'll get a wave of bullets back.
Right.
And so when you look at the advantage that he had, just being able to walk down the street, he's walking and running down the street. He's not standing in front of a piece of property of his employer.
Yeah, but I think, but again, adhering to the law, the common belief out there is that he went out there with a gun, crossed state lines to confront the protesters, and he's essentially going out there and walking around, and then he got into a confrontation with the protesters. But is that in fact how it went down? That's not exactly how it did go down. Exactly. So I think that's really to understand this, and to me, and to really get to the root issues of what this is really raising, is that we got to have a real clear understanding of what happened. And again, and how it played out in court. He did legally have the gun. The gun, in fact, was already there in the state. His friend had the gun, and there's some issue there where his friend is now potentially going to be prosecuted for those, because of illegalities of holding on to the gun until Kyle became 18 and all of this. His friend is going to catch a little heat over this, right? But people are believing that he came across the lines with a gun. He didn't come across the lines with a gun. He wasn't going to the protest to go confront protesters in that sense. And so to me, and why I'm saying this, because I look at this from a journalistic point of view, having covered trials, and knowing that what that jury is presented with oftentimes, and how the limitations of what they have to make a decision on is a lot different than what we're getting out here oftentimes in the public sphere. Right. And there's a lot of this misinformation that fuels it. And then again, from a journalism standpoint, I think of it as a journalist, our role should be to clearly help people understand what in fact did happen. And I think it's important to understand that that Kyle Rittenhouse didn't just go across the state lines with an M16 and confront, and that also played into how the jury had to decide his case.
Well, you're exactly right. It's how do you characterize it? But I think that the defense did a great job. in painting their client as the victim.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. They painted him as the victim. They painted him as a person engaged in self-defense, even though the video clearly showed it was instigation that was taking place throughout the going back and forth in the street and things of that nature. Like I said, if you're there to defend property, you stand in front of your property and defend it.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going through the street, walking around and the like. And you're not also instigating against others that are there. You're doing, when you, just like any officers or guards or trained professionals, military, you're trained not to take the first shot. You're trained to de-escalate or the situation. When you pull that trigger, that's the last. I mean, you had no other option, basically,
Mm-hmm.
that you had to choose. So, but to your point, of course, the prosecution said that they're disappointed. As a matter of fact, looking at the latest CNN article, they said the jury represented the community in the trial, which it was a nearly all-white jury pool. One person looked as if they were was a person of color, but there was no designation who that person was. Also, you had 7 women and 5 men in that jury. Of course, 2 were dismissed, one because of a racial joke with the sheriff about Jacob Blake. So they showed he could have been prejudicial. And then the other because of her pregnancy, because of medical reasons. But what the prosecution said that it sends the unacceptable message that armed civilians can show up in any town, incite violence, and then use the danger they've created to justify shooting people in the street. So, that's really how I think that the public is going to take this. And I think what has happened, Will, I believe that this verdict has now emboldened these types of actions to happen in the future. I mean, keep in mind, here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, Charlottesville was not that long ago.
Right.
Here in the Commonwealth of Virginia and in Michigan, the armed militia that had literally planned to kidnap the governor of the state of Michigan and the Commonwealth of Virginia was not that long ago.
Right.
All right, we're talking less than a year. All right. Keep in mind, even though it's been some decades, the actions of the terrible, terrible, terrible actions of Timothy McVeigh was not that long ago. Keep in mind that even though it was a few more decades ago, the shooting at the clock tower at the University of Texas was not that long ago. These are individuals that believe these extremist ideas that we need to take our country back. We need to take action when we feel that there are others who are going to destroy it or impede upon our freedoms. So again, that's kind of what I foresee. I foresee a bolstering. I foresee individuals utilizing this as justification. I see more and more and more people going to the borders to protect the borders where they believe that the Border Patrol is not doing their job, right? Again, taking law in their own hands.
Well, I agree with you about there's a certain element that may feel emboldened by what is going on, but is that justified that they would feel emboldened? It is what Kyle Rittenhouse did aligned with Timothy McVeigh. Again, there are, in the trial, if people really paid attention to the trial and how the defense did a much better job of addressing the facts and showing how this is, in their eyes, was a self-defense case and not a vigilante case. I think that that's something that's important for people to understand. So look, I pulled up this article from the Business Insider. They're talking about the various myths in this case. And so one of the things is that it's unclear. A lot of people have been saying, okay, this case is showing that if you're white and you're protesting on behalf of injustice towards Black people, this is a sign to you that, that's not something that you want to do. We're going to gun you down in the streets. But the fact of the matter is, again, condolences to the family and people's lives that were lost. It's not clear what the motives were of the individuals that Rittenhouse confronted. So according to Business Insider, they say Gage, I believe it's Gage Grosskreutz. I'm sorry if I messed up the name. He was a 27-year-old EMT. He survived the shooting, and he was there as a medic to perform assistance to anyone who needed it during the protest, right? So we got, at least he was there for those reasons. Then we look to the gentlemen whose lives were lost. Joseph Rosenbaum, 36, was less clear that night. Rosenbaum was seen in a number of videos not protesting, but causing destruction, setting fires, tipping over a porta potty, wielding a chain, and at one point even shouting the N-word. Rittenhouse's defense attorney characterized Rosenbaum as a rioter, and even the lead prosecutor said in his closing statement he would have prosecuted Rosenbaum for arson had he not been fatally shot. Then Rosenbaum's fiancee told Washington Post in 2020 that he wasn't there as a rioter or a looter. Just hours before the protest, Rosenbaum had been released from the hospital following psychiatric care for a suicide attempt. So again, condolences to the family. That is actually obviously a person who was in pain, in trouble. But people are operating on the misnomer that these men who lost their lives were there supporting the cause of the peaceful protesters who were out there. And my point is, I think that if we don't get the facts right and understand what truly is going on here, then the fears and the emboldenedness of what you just spoke about is a lot more likely to happen. You know, this is not necessarily a case of a young man who took a gun across state lines to confront protesters, and then when he brought his gun to the fight, he ended up killing people. So it's like, well, why did you go there? I think you're absolutely right that in this case, and this is what has me upset about it, is what you said earlier, that if this was an African American or Latino man who had done the same exact thing, the system would not have operated fairly and looked at the facts and parsed it out and really got into the details. The likelihood is that it would have been much more assumed that he was just a rabble rouser that went there and started trouble and so forth and confronted people. Imagine if a Black person had gone to the January 6th insurrection, right? They called that a protest. So he could have gone there armed to protect, the property in around the DC area across the street or whatever, and confronted protesters and then ended up killing somebody. Absolutely. What would the likelihood of him being viewed as a patriot who came and who was acting within his legal rights? What's the likelihood of him being viewed that way? We know that would not have been the case. So for me, for Kyle Rittenhouse, the system actually did absolutely work for him. And that's the problem, that when it comes to Black and brown people versus white people, the same system does not look at us as human beings, as a 17-year-old, he's going to be 18. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. The system doesn't do that.
Yeah, well, look, I couldn't agree with you more. You're right. The system did work for him. We all know, even those that may not say it, and we know that there is trepidation across the board when talking about these issues. Mm-hmm. But we know that if this was a non-white individual, it would be a very, very, very different scenario because of the reason why for the unrest, the shooting of Jacob Blake, and all the things that transpired before that and moving forward. But one thing, I think you're right, Will. You got to get the facts straight. And the prosecution, according to the CNN article, actually was facing an uphill battle. But we know that based on the law. As a matter of fact, I just want to quote this sentence here. So in the state of Wisconsin, it requires the state to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the highest level, all right, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the defendant, the defendant did not act, which is Rittenhouse, in self-defense. Now, there are limits to self-defense claim, right, but the defendant, Rittenhouse, may intentionally use force which is intended or likely to cause death or great bodily harm, only if the defendant reasonably believed that the force used was necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself. So when you talk about the what was taking place, there was a drone video that was showing Rittenhouse shooting Rosenbaum that was really at the heart of the defense, according to his article, to request a mistrial in the case. So basically, they got him on the stand. They showed him very emotional, which, there's been some critique of that.
Yeah, there have been.
So you can take a look at the critique from various sources. But he was on, basically the defense, his attorneys prepared him very well. I'm just going to say that. And basically he said, listen, I didn't do anything wrong. I defended myself. So he was charged with 5 felonies. And of course, the misdemeanors, of course, they were thrown out by the judge, which I didn't really understand why the judge dismissed those misdemeanor weapons possession charges and non-criminal curfew violations prior to the deliberations.
Right.
But I thought they also should have been added, prior to them being requested before that. So with that being the case, with that burden that the prosecution had, right, that was a very high burden. Right?
Very high, very high.
They could have actually looked at this case and started to charge. Of course, you want to charge with every crime, right? That's what you're taught first year criminal law school. Charged with the highest crime and what's called the lesser and included offenses, right? Lesser and included. In the event that you're not able to meet the level of evidence that it takes to meet every single element of the highest crime, then it may meet those lesser and included crimes.
So shoot for son. If you make it to the move, you still got to win, right?
You still got to win, right? So again, I thought that some of those charges could have been added in prior to, but with that, but it is what it is. They tried to add it in, but of course the judge dismissed those. In addition to that, I also saw in this case where there wasn't a lot of, and I think this is prior some of the comments that the judge made. There wasn't a lot of information given out on a daily basis to the people to really understand before the trial actually happened what these charges were, what it actually meant, what will happen, if the person is not convicted of this and so forth, just to prepare, the country so that they can understand what is at stake. And I think if the public would have known this high level of charges and also the burden of proof that the prosecution had to prove and what the defense was going to do, because trial is just a well-rehearsed end. We all know what's going to happen at trial. It's just the execution of it, right? So it's all there in the pretrial order. We know what witnesses are being called. We know what jurors are on the jury pool after voir dire, challenges and the like. We all know it. It's just being able to execute. Now, when you compare and contrast this against the case in Minnesota, and the prosecution was well prepared. They prepared their witnesses extremely well. Even with the history of drugs and so forth of the deceased, they prepared the witnesses phenomenally in order to provide them to look human as opposed to look like a heathen, right? So
you talk about the Chauvin trial, right?
Absolutely.
Regarding the murder of George Floyd, Minnesota case, right?
And what the defense did, they did the exact same thing that the prosecution did in Minnesota. Whereas the prosecution in this case simply did not. So when we take a look and compare and contrast, like you said, Will, it's very important that we understand the facts, the charges, the burden of proof, and what actually transpired, and look at the jury and kind of see where, of course, things are going to come out afterwards, but understand what the jurors were actually hearing, seeing, looking at during the entire trial.
Right. And what they were charged to actually deliver a verdict on. And that brings me to the judge. The judge and his shenanigans. I mean, it's like in a case like this, I think that a lot of times in the legal system, I think in the journalism industry, we're so much in the bubble and so much in the day-to-day of what we do that could be a little oblivious to how what we do affects the broader society. So where am I going with this? the judge needs to understand that he's operating in a context of people in society seeing all of these court shows and cop shows and so forth, and thinking that the way that it's often portrayed in the cop shows and the court shows is how it actually goes down in a courtroom when you are faced with that, when you're in a real courtroom. We're operating in the context of the O.J. Simpson trial and some of these other trials that we have seen that have been so sensationalized, right? And so it's so easy, for a judge to add to that distraction, add to all of that sensationalism when they're adding all these different shenanigans into it. And so he starts to become the story. He starts to become, is he fair? He's acting like he's on the defense team and all of this. When, as you just pointed out, what the jury is really looking at and what they're really charged to make a judgment on is so much a finer line, and it can very times be very complicated, and complex, that you're sitting in that jury room, and again, you've been a lot of times sequestered, or you're not able to read what's going on in the media, and you really have to focus on what is the evidence that's being presented. And it just, when you add these kind of shenanigans and distractions, to me, it makes it more difficult once a decision is rendered for the people in society now afterwards to understand and to process what really went down. And so the judge, in many ways, there's been critiques on both sides saying that, this judge on a day-to-day basis doing his work for several years is actually a good judge. But we see him in these shenanigans, it's like, come on. And it just feeds the impression that many of us already have of this what I call legal injustice system. It just feeds that. It just feeds that notion. And then when you don't understand all of the other fine-tuned elements of the case, it just makes it very easy for people to just go into their respective corners where they already have an opinion on it anyway, and just operate in life with more distrust, with more dissatisfaction of being able to get justice if they have to go before the justice system. Right. And I think that the judges and the attorneys really, when the cameras are on, to me, instead of being more emboldened by the cameras and becoming actors, they should really become even more sober, even more professional, understanding that, the public, their view of what's going on in this courtroom may not be the same, may not be playing out the same in the public as it is playing out in that courtroom. And the unfortunate thing is, I don't see that changing anytime, because lawyers so much, just like politicians, because so many politicians come out of, law schools and are lawyers themselves, all they think about in terms of is winning and losing. Winning or losing, that's it, win at any cost. Winning or losing, be damned what happens afterwards.
Well, I'm not going to say that, but that is a large part of it.
That's a huge part of it, man. You guys win at any cost. Say anything and win at any cost, and be damned what the ramifications are afterwards.
Yeah. So, to your point, like I said, I'm not going to disagree. But that's not.
But you're a lawyer. You can defend your profession.
But if you're not winning, in the words of one of those movies, if you ain't first, you're last. So with that, I want to come back to a point that you made, and then we're going to take a look at, when we talk about trust in the justice system, look at the Auburn trial and what's really on trial there.
Right.
In this case, in the Kyle Rittenhouse case, again, what is happening, I think that a lot of people are going to utilize this to galvanize their side on all sides.
Right.
I think what's happening on what's called the right, we're seeing one of the U.S. congresspersons offering him an internship on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, please.
We see a documentary that's coming out, sponsored by Fox News.
Totally irresponsible.
We see individuals now utilizing this as gun rights in sparking more debates over gun rights and race. We're seeing more this is going to spark more discussion about stand your ground. This is going to spark more debate around racial issues as relates to who can trust the justice system,
right,
who can trust the police and the like. So when I say utilizing this to galvanize, and I think what's going to end up happening, unfortunately, this is going to be utilized to divide. But I think that we could utilize this to not just have a debate, but more specifically, we utilize this to have a substantive discussion about solutions. And well, I think that's where we are. I think we have to have that, because if we don't have that, I think what's going to happen is that we're going to get more and more of these events that take place on a larger scale, on a much larger scale. And it's going to take place, unfortunately, in an inopportune time where our country really needs to be together. I think it's going to end up causing our country to become more galvanized and more polarized around their efforts than coming together. So, but I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, but we'll see what happens after this documentary comes out about this particular case. But I hope, like you said, I hope they do the right thing. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think another thing that needs to happen is some real clear legislation regarding what is self-defense.
Yeah.
You also mentioned stand your ground. I mean, the stand your ground laws are still unclear, and you've got more and more stand your ground laws across the state since we first heard of stand your ground a couple of years ago. And you think about the Trayvon Martin case, and this bordering on vigilantism, and also what does it mean to engage in self-defense? It's not clear.
Case, real quick, that was another case that if you go back and listen to the 911 tape, they told him to stay in the car, call the police, and he made the statement. He said, "These people always get away,"
right.
And he engaged that young man. And where he lived with his father.
This is the Florida case.
Yeah, the Florida case where he lived with his father, half the time with his mom, half the time with Florida because of the divorce situation.
And the white gentleman was convicted on this. He was convicted in that.
Absolutely.
Thank God. Right.
So again, it's one of those things where. Wait, but did you say that he was convicted?
I believe. Yeah. I believe that gentleman was. He was convicted.
No, he actually got off. I mean, that was one of the main issues in that particular case.
No. Well, let's. Yeah, if you can check that out, let's be clear on that, because again, I think being clear and having the right information is key. And right now, self-defense. What is legal self-defense? That's not clear. That's not clear, and it seems like that used to be something that we kind of understood. Hey, if I'm being attacked, I have a right to defend myself. If the attack is over, then I need to withdraw. I don't need to continue. And that also, if I'm being attacked, then what is justifiable self-defense is that I respond with equal force. I mean, if somebody's attacking you in a fist fight, you don't respond by blowing them up with a hand grenade and call that self-defense. So these things are just not, they're just not clear. I was talking about I think you were talking about Trayvon Martin. I was talking about the other case. I think that was up in Jacksonville, where there was
right. So you're exactly right. So we'll be clear on that. George Zimmerman was convicted. I mean, was acquitted.
Yeah, he was let go. The other case, right. I believe that was up in Jacksonville, where the young man was shot by a white man because of he talked about, his music is too loud and so forth, and he tried to claim stand your ground. I think he was convicted.
Yeah.
But that's what I think that's important, is instead of the politicians being irresponsible and talking about offering internships and then turning around and raising money on the backs of, this is still a 17, just turned 18-year-old young man. And you're going to raise money on his back and like you said, embolden other people in the white nationalist movement and so forth, who he may not exactly be aligned with. I think that that's important. That as we start getting distracted by these other things about whether or not he's a budding member of the Proud Boys and all of this, I think we end up losing our sight on what is really the threat here, which is why is it that black and brown people, the system can't work in the way for us as it has for this young man who was white? Because clearly, I don't think there's anyone that believes that a young black man, 17 years old, same situation, that he would not have been put under the prison. And then the other thing is, what does this now mean for people's a right to peacefully protest? Does it mean if people are out peacefully protesting that if you disagree with them, that you can come there armed, and if you feel like you are being attacked or someone does respond to your provocation, that they can lose their life and you get to walk free? To me, those are the two things that are very crucial here, that are really at risk going long term. And some of these other stuff that has happened around the case are distractions. And I think we really need to be clear on what happened in this case and what really needs to be done around what does it mean to exercise self-defense.
Right. And Will, to your point, Michael Dunn was the person convicted of shooting the young man at the gas station over loud music.
Right.
And he actually lost his bid to overturn that particular conviction. So Michael Dunn was convicted. George Zimmerman was acquitted.
Right.
But with that, one point I want to bring out with the Ahmaud Arbery case, because I know we're in our last few minutes here, is that in this case, when we take a look at walking and jogging and observing while black in different neighborhoods, this is really a trial where the black community is looking at the justice system to determine if they can trust it. Now, in contrast to the Kyle Rittenhouse case, we're looking at a case that was in the Midwest, the most northern Midwest, Wisconsin. It's a very white state, and of course, the individuals engaged in both the defendants and the victims were also white.
Right.
And had a majority, almost all white jury pool. And of course, there's a different history, and the history is not that long of racial issues in that particular state. Now, compare and contrast that with the state of Georgia. Compare and contrast that with the history of the Confederacy. Compare and contrast that with the recent and past history of Brunswick, military area, but also of that area of Georgia. It's a different, totally different.
Very different world. Same country. Still same country.
You're exactly right, Will. So when you have black residents that live there, they live through the history of that particular part of Georgia itself and that particular part of Georgia. So now this case really has a lot riding on it for African American citizens, because now the question becomes, is the system going to work for them? With all of the evidence, and I think that the prosecution is doing a much better job in this case than the case we just looked at. And of course, a lot of the evidence that's there is evidence that was gathered by video. We can see it, also audio, eyewitness testimony, and the like. So there's a lot that goes into this particular case where I think, and of course, the testimony that's transpired on the stand by one of the accused, one of the defendants. So I think a lot of this, of what we're seeing now, I believe this verdict is going to go in a different direction. I believe that it's going to go in a direction where we see where the system will hold individuals accountable when they are acting recklessly with an intent that is to hurt, harm, or put others in danger. I also thought that in this particular case, the way that it's being covered is being covered in a way that we're getting a lot of information before and also during the trial, where it helps to taper expectations and feelings, high emotions, and feelings where it could bubble up to the top and really cause the opposite outcome that we want in our nation. And that outcome is not to be a nation where we are divided, but a nation instead where we come together.
You know, I saw an interview with Mr. Arbery's mother, and she expressed a lot of optimism and hope that the trial, that there would be justice. I mean, you tell me from your gut, you know, as an attorney, you know, as an African-American man, seeing these situations, I mean, what gives you the sense that this is going to be a more just outcome than we've seen as you compare it to the Rittenhouse trial? Because I'm not, the thing about the Rittenhouse trial I find to be unjust is I'm not sure that he shouldn't have gotten convicted on something. It's something that is not correct about going across state lines like that and somebody's lives being taken. And, you know, but again, when you get to the specifics of the law, if you can't convict somebody, even though it just doesn't feel right, then you have to stand tall on the law. So in this case, going down in Georgia, when you look at the law and you look at what feels right, because it does not feel right that these men tracked him down, hunted him down essentially, and killed him. But what gives you hope when it comes to the law and how this may play out in the courtroom, that there's going to be justice?
Sure. So what gives me hope is that the charges, they actually went back and these individuals were actually arrested, charged, and indicted. And the charges themselves, I think, are ones that can be proven based upon the standard of this particular, in this state as it applies to this case. So I think there are multiple steps that gives me hope and optimism and how the prosecution has handled it. Now, keep in mind, they weren't arrested initially, right?
Right,
but
right.
And keep in mind also,
the prosecutor didn't even want to prosecute it. Yeah,
exactly. And also keep in mind, in Minnesota, you know, George Floyd, you know, the police department was not forthcoming and with the information, and the police report was not as clear as it should have been. Right. So this is something where it's not as if our systems are doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
Right.
But it's working because the people that operate around and within the system are pushing the narrative. And that's really where change really comes, Will. So those steps in seeing this case transpire across each level, where it comes from the investigation to the arrest, to the charges, to the indictment, to the voir dire. Now, keep in mind, there were a lot of challenges to the jury pool, so there's only one Black person on the jury, right? So that becomes problematic itself because we're still looking at bias in jury selection. And even a judge mentioned that this could be problematic, but they allowed it to go on. So, but with that being the case, those steps give me optimism, and I believe that, again, it's not about these people are wrong and they should get it. And I'm not looking at it from that aspect. I'm looking at it from an accountability aspect in ensuring that the process works, right? So from that view, from that standard, from that analysis, I think we're going to get a verdict in favor of the prosecution in this case, as opposed to not. But we'll be back to discuss that once the verdict comes down. So we want to thank you guys for joining us again for this segment of LaVeist and ClaVille. Again, you can find us on social media at LaVeist and ClaVille, or our website at www.laveistclaville.com. Like us, share us, play it back, and tell us how we're doing. And for all your support, we thank you. Until next time, that's the way we see it. That's the way it is. We'll see you. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to another episode of LaVeist and ClaVille. Make sure you subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. For information or to connect with LaVeist and ClaVille, check out our website at www.laveistclaville.com. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the LaVeist and ClaVille on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. This has been the latest episode of LaVeist and ClaVille.